Start the game already!
Are you drunk yet?
I have steam whistle. These are tall boys, so yeah, kind of a little.
Excellent.
What kind of Blue Oyster cult bullshit have you got?
No, I got rid of the Blue Lobster shit. I'm drinking Brickworks, Cider House, Queen Street, 501.
Okay. Back to the good stuff.
I wouldn't go so far as to say good, better. You know what? I'm not a big fan of lime in drinks. Like, I don't mind pop, right? Like, that's a lemon lime pop, like 7-Up or Sprite. But in
the
alcoholic
Angola
beverages, no.
You know what's actually really good is ginger and lime and vodka.
Yeah.
If you're into that kind of thing. So, do you have any good news to share about things that have happened in the last week, the last month, last year?
Nope.
Oh, wow. Well, that's
Dude,
depressing.
I'm at that point in my life where it's just like, I don't want to say I'm counting the days until I die, but I mean, I've raised my family, my kids are out of the house. Hell, I'm going to blink and my grandkids will be out of their house.
I don't know if anyone's getting out of anyone's house in the rest of our lifetimes.
It's weird, the empty nest thing. Like, I think Tanya and have fallen into the trappings of routine, and we need to figure out a way to get out of it.
You need to buy a sex swing.
I've been saying these things.
You just got to find one that'll support your weight. I'm just saying.
Because I'll be the one in the swing, right?
That's right.
It's true. Hey, whatever.
Yeah. Hey, you're married.
That's not the way I thought we'd start this podcast, but hey, we're into it now. We're no longer a Baldur's Gate podcast. We're a sex toy / furniture apparati podcast.
One of the things, my parting gift from last episode was a webcomic called Questionable Content. One of the things I wanted to say about it, and I forgot to, was that he has a little blurb at the bottom of every comic. It's like a half a sentence or a phrase or whatever. And one of the things he put in there was, I had a fan who came up to me at a convention, and he was like, because I've always read it as questionable content, right? It makes sense. It's actually addressed, I think, in the first series of comics.
Mm-hmm.
But he's like, this fan came up to me and said, I've always read it as, because there's a lot of relationship type stuff. And when he said, I've always read it as questionable content. And he's like, and it made me think, it's like, yeah, that kind of fits. But the thing that brought it to mind again was the whole sex toy thing. One of the characters in the comic has the job. It's a minor character, but they have a job that they test sex toys at a sex toy factory. Right. And of course, everybody looks at them and are like, no. Like, with hydraulic presses and, we set things on fire and, like quality controlled sort of safety testing. But the very first thing you think is like, oh yeah, like can you imagine a podcast that was literally about testing sex toys?
There's some podcasts out there, but I gotta say, like, Tanya has started listening to podcasts recently, and she listens to a lot of true crime stuff. Like, it's the most popular genre ever. But then she's listening to stuff that there's one, God, I can't remember the name of it. Is it called Bad Dates or something like that?
Oh no.
And it is not just people talking about bad dates, but it's the type of people that date and hook up like you and I play video games. Like, it is raunchy. It is just like, hey, I'm a dude, and yeah, dudes think about sex a lot, but I listened to her listening to this episode, and I'm listening to these people tell their stories, and I'm like, how's your back?
Man, my favorite comment about sex of all time happened on a panel show for the BBC. And it's uh, a lady who she hosts her own sort of panel show now, but she started off as a professional poker player. She has like, I don't know, a PhD in something. She's very, very smart. And she got married to a comedian, and now she shows up as a guest on all kinds of panel show type things. And the topic turns around to like, like how do people do sex? Like how long does it take? And everybody's into all the romantic things. There's lots of foreplay, and you lay out rose petals. And she's like, no, get in, get out. Like I got to work in the morning. I want to go to sleep. I'm like, nobody's got time for that. I'm like, oh my God. Like and the way that she delivered it was so deadpan. Like, she's not really serious, but at the same time, she's like, just it's a chore. Just get it over with, get it done, move on.
There's the one thing that I definitely want to hear while having sex is we just get it over with.
Oh yeah. I mean, that ends it right
That
there.
ends it right there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's done. Like we're done. We're done here. I'm gonna go play with the electric toothbrush. I'll be back in 10 minutes.
Yeah. Hey, listen, you know what? I'm pretty comfortable talking about sex and things. Like I don't have a lot of taboos.
YouTube might.
It's not this isn't a parting gift, but I'm going to go back and mention this podcast that my wife's been listening to because it features people like we talked about it a little bit in our last episode about how Baldur's Gate 3 portrayed sex in a little bit more of an adult manner. It's something that happens that doesn't have to be tied to a romantic relationship. Like sometimes people just do it for the fun. A lot of times people just do it for the fun, and it is a carnal physical activity. It's lustful. It doesn't have anything to do with love sometimes. And that it was interesting to see that portrayed in a game. The guests on this show, like I'm not even sure they're part of the same species as I am,
Yeah.
right? Like they're just and I don't, again, it is not like I'm not looking at what they're doing, yucking their yum, or I don't find it distasteful, but just how big a part of their lives hooking up with random people sometimes is. Like I won't go so far as to say they've made it their identity, but it's eye-opening. And it's entertaining. Like there's funny stories. I'm not shitting on this podcast at all. Quite the opposite. Like if you weren't turned off by people very openly and honestly talking about sex and some like funny sex stories, give it a listen. I mean, it isn't my bag. I'm not somebody who's going to tune in and listen to it myself. But like when my wife has it on, I've got an ear turned towards it, and I find it interesting at least. So check it out. Kind of a parting gift.
What's it called again?
Bad Dates. I think it's part of a network. So there's another podcast that she listens to that has a bunch of actors like Will Arnett and Jason Bateman and something. I forget what it's called. I don't know. She listens to that, and I think this was sort of a spin-off show of that, or it's being produced by the same group anyway. So it's like high production value, a lot of money behind it. Hey, and this may come as a surprise, but podcasts can actually have talented and charismatic like hosts and performers and stuff. So it's all very, very well done.
My God, we're doomed.
I know, right?
We are not competitive in this space.
Yeah. So we're gonna have to pivot into something else. We're no longer a Baldur's Gate 3 podcast. We're no longer a sex podcast. That was short-lived. Now we're going to be a history podcast.
It was short-lived like the act itself in my house.
5 minutes? What am I going to do with the other 4.5 minutes? Like,
I could have a shower.
All right. So I had this idea, and this was one of those a few weeks ago. Oh my God, we're going to record tonight and we don't have anything to talk about. And I threw this idea out and then we didn't use it. And I decided I wanted to talk about it because, again, I was looking at my show doc 15 minutes before we were getting ready to record, and I'm like, ooh, that second episode's looking a little bit sparse. So this should be interesting because A, you're about half in the bag, so am I.
Oh, at least.
B, I know you've not prepped for this at all.
It's a question I've had before, though.
Oh yeah, I think it's a good question for a nerd, because like it's a question you shouldn't have to think about, and I'd be interested to see like what kind of answers come out of it. So to set this up a little bit, this is like nerdy hot tub time machine kind of thing. We want to look at this from an academic angle. So you've got a time machine, but you can't go back and change history, but you can kind of peer back into time and see history. And we want to talk about a few things that each of us would like to go back and see for whatever reasons. I'm kind of coming at it from an academic angle. I've really, in the past 5 or 6 years, I would say, really started digging into a lot of historical stuff, like way more than I ever did when I was in school. And not the type of histories that I would have been into at the time. So I find all sorts of shit interesting now. I'm uh, I'm one of those guys that knows enough about a lot of things to get themselves into trouble because when I regurgitate information, it's generally wrong. It's founded in truth and the things that I've heard, but I'm not an expert in anything. So as I'm talking about stuff today, and this probably applies to you,
Oh, yeah.
we're going to say some things that are factually inaccurate, and that's fine. This is an entertainment podcast, in addition
Oh.
to being a history and sex podcast.
It's a podcast about the history of sex. We'll try and make it entertaining.
So, aside from just going back and reading Wikipedia articles about video games by year, is there let's start with you. If you had a time machine or a window to peer back in time, what would you look into?
I would be interested. There's a couple of things that spring to mind immediately, and the first is the construction of Stonehenge.
Mhm.
I mean, I would probably have to cast back and forth a little bit to find out exactly when
Oh
that
yeah.
happened, but it would be interesting to see that. It would be interesting to see some of the sort of Celtic and early Britain things that happened, like the carving of the dude on the side of the hill, some things like that. The other thing that comes up in my brain is I would look back and watch the crucifixion, because I mean that is a historical event as far as we
Mhm.
can tell, right? It would be interesting to see not so much the crucifixion itself, but the reaction of the crowd around it.
Yeah.
Like just what was the average man on the street thinking at the time? You know, I have
So
a
so let's
I have a
extend the rules of this a little bit because I
okay.
actually had a controversial option here. So instead of just looking back at time, let's say you can interact with history but can't change anything. My
Oh,
controversial option, operating under the assumption that Jesus, the man, really existed, which I think most scholars, like scientists, actually believe he existed. Wouldn't it be great to go back and have a beer or a wine with the guy? Hear what he actually has to say. Now, there's we're hand waving a lot of stuff away here. Language barriers. Obviously, you'd need to prep for something like this, right? You're not going to go back and speak modern English to Jesus and have any sort of exchange of information there. You're probably going to immediately catch diseases and either kill Jesus or die yourself.
yeah.
We're hand waving all of that away.
We're going back in the TARDIS.
It's a thought experiment here. But go back and have a beer with Jesus and just hear what he has to say, like straight from the horse's mouth.
Well, okay, I mean, in the theme of the podcast, here's it. Rather than like, what would you watch it? If you could go back in time and have a beer with any individual in history, who would it be? Now, obviously, Jesus is off the table because we've already covered that one. Language barrier aside, universal translator, slug in your ear, whatever you wanted. The Babelfish.
I'm going to take the short answer, just like the cheat answer, because it's obvious for nerds, and that'd be Leonardo da Vinci. Like
Yeah.
such an intriguing, interesting mind of his time. And there's probably a lot that hasn't survived through history, and that's what's really interesting about this thought experiment is in a lot of this stuff that we're interested enough to want to look back, we have some information, some tantalizing things to hook into us and make us interested, but how much of it is story, how much of it is based in reality. We have enough physical, tangible things about Leonardo da Vinci to say, even in his time, this was a special man, a special mind.
Yeah, absolutely true.
To just have a beer with the guy, like,
Just shoot the shit.
like that would be an obvious choice. And there's some other people, but like I've got a few other things on my list here that would bring those people into the fold. So I'm not gonna recycle my answers, but
I have this is a little bit out of left field. My choice of someone to go back and have a beer and just like shoot the shit with is Shaka Zulu. For a couple of reasons. Number one, like in Western culture, at least, we know almost nothing about this person.
mhm,
Um, and second, like because our cultures would be so different, it would just be
mhm,
so interesting to me to see like what is happening in their mind about the world and how it's changing.
mhm.
And it would also be interesting to see like what was society in Africa at that time actually like, because I have a feeling that everything that we know about it is wrong.
Oh, absolutely. We've got some tantalizing tastes, like through modern archaeology, and you have to push through centuries of established racism and all the barriers that are put in place around it. But there's something that you have to keep in mind when it comes to, and I'm going to talk specifically about sub-Saharan Africa here,
Hmm.
is that for the vast majority of time that humans, anatomically modern humans, have been alive and about in the world, the Sahara Desert is like the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah,
It's just a boundary that very, very few people at any point in history crossed.
or even probably thought about crossing.
So, I mean, there's some, obviously, like, we as a species migrated out of Africa and radiated into Eurasia and stuff. Like it's happened, but
There's some argument about that.
there is that, funny enough, probably on my list. But for the vast majority of history, the desert, the Sahara Desert, was like crossing the ocean. It was like the new world, like, oh my God, there's the Americas are a thing. I was looking for India, and well, I guess those guys kind of look like Indians, right?
Guess.
But what that means, like from a archaeological and anthropological sense, is that so much of what happened in deep history in southern Africa has just been completely lost, and we've now got tantalizing tastes that civilizations rose and fell that would
Mhm.
have rivaled any of the contemporary civilizations in Europe and Asia at the time.
Yeah.
But we know tons about Romans, we know tons about the Greeks, we know tons about Persia, and going back even to Samaria and Assyria and what we would consider the cradle of civilization. Well, all of that shit was going on in southern Africa too, but
We don't have a record.
we don't have a record for the vast majority of recorded history. There's been very little interest in doing anything besides, looting Egypt, right? Everything that went on
Yeah.
south of the desert was just whatever. These are people that were, not capable of developing the levels of civilization that we would be interested in. And surprise, actually probably
Right.
some of the more advanced civilizations at the time happened down
Well,
there, and
we
it's a
just don't know.
blind spot in history.
Yeah, and that's the reason that I think it would be an interesting angle to take.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting thought. and I'm not. I'm 2.5 sheets to the wind here, and again, not an expert by
Hmm.
any means, but the idea of, if you think about like Madagascar, or the big turtles in Charles Darwin, the Galapagos Islands,
Yep.
like things that sort of were allowed to develop without a whole lot of outside interference. I wonder how much different society develops when you don't have a bombardment of outside influences. And I'm not talking about like immigration. Like in the modern world, we're just, that doesn't exist anywhere. Because
Hmm.
even if you stop people from crossing your borders, ideas cross borders now. Like we are on
Hmm.
the road to becoming like one global civilization. And I think that that's a good thing on the whole. But I wonder, like, because it's so many, like, if you look at the history, especially of Europe, and Southern Europe in particular, when you're talking about like Italy and Greece, and the south of France, and southern Germany, and that kind of stuff, like it's a history of, there was this war, and then at the same time that was going on, there was this war, and then this war, and then it was just like, it's literally an overlapping mosaic of wars from the beginning of when we started writing things down. Like the history of Europe may as well just be a list of how people died. Like
Hmm.
it could be the Book of the Dead. That's the history of Europe. And I'm wondering if you take, and I'm not suggesting that there wasn't conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm sure there was,
Oh, absolutely.
because that's human nature, right? But I wonder how much different like society would be if you, for example, the idea of Atlantis. Here's this
Hmm.
island in the middle of nowhere where they don't have to worry about going hungry. They don't have to worry about invaders. They don't have to worry about
Hmm.
everybody has to carry a spear. How different
Semi
would society be?
semi
Society.
related. And I'm not going to get into it like in this topic so much, but have you ever looked into is it North Sentinel Island, the Sentinelese? It's like the one sort of population of people that like it's actually illegal to visit this island and interfere with the culture. And some people have tried over the years and just immediately been killed. So you've probably seen some videos of where
I've
like
heard I've heard
yeah, like
something about it. I didn't know it
yeah,
was.
like a Christian missionary tries to go out and there's these people come out and just shoot them full of arrows. And there was some exchanges that happened with some scientists at one point, decades and decades ago, but it went sideways, and they just said, you know what, we're going to leave these people fucking alone.
Makes sense.
But and it obviously this is a, as far as we can tell, looking at it from the outside, a very very sort of stereotypical old school tribal culture. You know, hasn't developed the technologies that sharing of information with a widespread population and sort of standing on the backs of those that came before you in developed society where writing exists, right?
Mm.
That hasn't happened there. I want to say that they, at one point in time, maybe during one of the wars, somebody landed a plane on the island. I might be mixing it up with something else. So there has been a little bit of contamination, but still relatively very little compared to every other place in the world that we know about. And if
Mm.
you haven't read up on it or watched some videos about it, it's definitely worth checking out. I
I
think
will
North
check it out.
Sentinel Island, Sentinel, you just YouTube Island, you'll find something.
Okay.
Before I move on to one of mine, I want to get actually back to your first mention, which was Stonehenge. What do you know about Stonehenge?
I not much. It's rocks, and they're sort of stood on top of each other. It has nothing to do with druids. It is a heritage site, but if you get a photo from the inside of it looking out, it's not very big, and it's surrounded by highways. Um, it's I think people are still arguing about whether it was this or whether it was that or whether it was this. I think it was probably just some kind of ceremonial thing where they like, let's build a circle out of rocks.
And it's something that probably evolved and had multiple purposes over the centuries. I mean, it's an interesting thing just because it's so incredibly old.
Yep.
Like we think about things like the pyramids at Giza, the Great Pyramids as being like really, really, really old.
Stonehenge was
and
old when they were
Stonehenge
built.
was, yeah, is like as old as the pyramids are now when the pyramids were built.
One of the interesting things about Stonehenge is the word henge, or the definition of what a henge is, was actually developed from Stonehenge.
Mhm,
Stonehenge is not a henge. I can't remember why it's not a henge, but
mhm.
it's not.
Um, what I find interesting about Stonehenge is it is probably the best example of the tendency for, let's just call them what they are, conspiracy theorists,
Loonies?
alternate scientists, or whatever,
No.
to completely disregard just how capable and intelligent humans have been the entire time. Like
Oh,
the idea
forever.
that, oh, it had to be aliens because, these rocks are too big for primitive humans to lift. Well, you know what? They probably were more equipped to do it than we are. Like, have you looked at us?
Yeah, physically,
I've actually
definitely.
watched videos, just sort of like experimental archaeology, where they just try and like think their way through the process of doing these things with the limitations that people back at the time would have had. And at almost the same scale, a lot of the biggest sort of like T stones and stuff at Stonehenge could be moved by a single person.
Yeah,
Once they're you have to construct them in the right way. You're sort of digging them out so that they might not have understood the mathematics,
they
but
probably did.
they might have very well had a bigger grasp on it, or a much larger grasp than we thought. But things like understanding leverage, you
Oh,
know
yeah. Leverage
like,
is not a new concept.
no, and this applies to the building of the pyramids too, right? Oh, these blocks weigh so many tons, how could they have lifted it? Come
Many,
on.
many different ways. I
Yeah,
mean, have
it's
you
just,
have you have you watched people in Northern Europe move houses?
yeah.
Right? Like you lay down some logs and four people can push a house.
Yeah. And this applies to like the Easter Island stuff too, where you see
Yeah.
people, just a small group of people, or even an individual one. Yeah, you build these things flat, you dig out under them, you're able to stand them up using leverage, and then you wiggle them. They literally, you walk these giant stones just by shifting the weight ever so slightly back and forth
Yep.
with minimal.
Yeah.
And if you ever catch yourself thinking that ancient humans lacked the ability to problem solve the same way we do, they had different tools than us.
Mhm.
They didn't always have thousands of years of past knowledge at their fingertips to sort of stand on top of. And that's why, they didn't have electric computers. And
Yeah.
I'm using electric in quotation marks there, because we're finding, what? They had
Yeah.
analog computers a long, long time ago.
Yeah. I mean, well, clockworks have been known about forever. And if you think about things like, counting sticks and like there's all kinds of tools that human beings use in order to leverage what we can do
Mhm.
into something greater than what it is.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you look at what are they called? Atlatls, where
Mhm.
you turn your throwing arm into a giant long throwing arm, and I mean that's an ancient tool.
Yeah.
So,
Like so ancient that while we don't have material history of it, there's a reasonably good chance that other hominids, non Homo sapiens,
yep.
other species in the genus Homo, were using these tools as well.
I mean, there's cave paintings of it, so it's very
Yep.
definitely like super old. And if you think about like then, so that is a, I mean, it is leverage, right?
Mhm.
It's turning the same force into more force. And if that concept was known and understood, then you know that people at the time who were uh, sort of mentally capable
Mhm.
would have thought, okay, well, can I leverage my thinking And how did they do that? I don't know. Marks in the dirt. Maybe that's what cave paintings are. Maybe that's what Stonehenge is. I don't know.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not an outlandish idea. I just know for sure that it has nothing to do with druids. Certainly not modern druids. Although somehow they've um, acquired a religious exemption to use Stonehenge for their religious rites, which is very bizarre. It's hard to get into Stonehenge. Really, really hard.
All right. So I think the first place I would go. Um, there's a period in history. So you have history, then you've got like old history, then you've got like very old history.
You've got
Going
prehistory.
back to like the earliest days of recorded history. There's a mystery in deep history called the Bronze Age collapse. Do you know much about it?
Nothing at all.
Okay. So to paint a picture here, we already mentioned what it was called the cradle of civilization back in the Mediterranean area. Civilizations. Now the Bronze Age collapse is something that happened in like the 13th and 12th century BCE. Like a half a century between like 1200 and 1150 BCE. When we saw the cultural collapse of a whole bunch of the most advanced civilizations that we're at least aware of at the time that have made it through to our time through the passage of history. So we're talking the Mycenaean kingdoms, Kassites in Babylonia, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia and Levant, the new kingdom of Egypt. They basically all disappeared all at once, and we have a lot of ideas of what may have contributed to it. Um, but we don't know. And
I,
we'll probably never know.
I vote that it was a housing bubble caused by the sale price of the pyramids.
I mean, it makes sense. I could understand how that could come to happen. But you've probably, for those of you that have heard a little bit about it, have heard about like, things called the Sea Peoples, this mysterious people that just sort of popped up out of nowhere and invaded places like Egypt, for instance. Um, and some of that probably happened, but nobody really identified, as far as I know, exactly who these sea peoples were. There's a lot of thought that it's likely a mass sort of migration of people that had to leave other areas due to things like drought and famine and climate changes and whatnot. There's been speculation of like certain volcanic eruptions that we've sort of dated to about the right time might have been significant contributors just due to the impact that they would have had on climate. And
Hmm?
we're talking some of the very, very early agricultural societies, and not that we have a lot of safety nets in our own societies, but they certainly would have had less safety nets back then,
Yeah.
right? And I don't know. Well, we may never know, but it is one of the great mysteries in history how all of these developed civilizations just disappeared. Yet there are other ones in the same sort of geographic areas that seem to be less impacted by them, and then some that sort of filled the vacuum afterwards.
Hmm.
But very,
Plagues?
very interesting.
Hmm. I wonder because there's an awful lot of things that come through in myths and legends of like religious texts and stuff. So
Hmm.
I wonder, like the plagues of Egypt and various things could
Yeah.
be the oral history
I
of things
saw
like
a
that.
very, very interesting series on, I want to say it was Curiosity Stream. I subscribed to like the Curiosity Stream and Nebula bundle for like $12 for a whole year. It was a pretty good deal. That sort of analyzing the plagues, the shit that went on in the Bible to try and find like real words, sort of like what could have happened. Things with the diversion of the Nile, trying to explain the plagues as if, okay, let's assume something happened that led to, that was interpreted this way.
Right.
What evidence can we find, and how can we try and explain it without, divine wrath? What would have led to these sort of things? And again, a lot of that ties to stuff like volcanic eruptions that would have happened a little further north into the Mediterranean area and Mesopotamia, but would have certainly impacted places like Egypt, where a lot of the context for these things uh, sort of
Oh.
happened. Stuff that made it into I won't say recorded history, but recorded legend. Traditions, stuff that has actually been
Yeah.
written down. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's like number one on my list of things that I would just like to go back and, I mean, I find those cultures interesting anyway, and it's sort of a new obsession for me. And hey, listen, some of these civilizations are, there's problems there. Okay, they're not. I'm not looking at them because I identify with the way they did things, but going back and looking at like the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and we're literally talking like the first major empire. Yes, they killed a lot of people and were absolutely horrible. And of all the early empires seem to kind of glorify that aspect of what they did. Maybe because that's how you were able to maintain empire back in the day. But it is very, very interesting to look back now that we're not too close to the bad things and the tragedy and all of that shit that happened. I think I mentioned this in another episode about, like, after I saw Oppenheimer, how there's certain things now that, like, you can't talk about the way you would talk about ancient history. Like, you can't talk about the Holocaust and Hitler and Nazis in a particular way right now, where you try and look at it through different lenses.
Yeah.
Where you can
No,
go back and look at something like even the Mongol Empire, which was, not thousands of years ago. Um, it
it was a while
was
ago,
it was a while ago, but it's not like we're not talking 3000 BCE or anything. We're talking, the
like six or eight
1200s
hundreds.
kind
Yeah.
of, but you already have people looking at somebody like Genghis Khan and trying to say, okay, yeah, he murdered millions or whatever, but let's look at this, like, step back, you know,
Yeah.
not take it personally, and look at all the good that came out of what the Mongols did. And you could argue, well, yes, there was trade that was established, parts of the world that had never really been completely connected before were connected forevermore, and yada yada yada,
Yeah.
you know and you're
Good
not
thing.
you're not burdened by the weight of millions and millions and millions of deaths like you are talking about, the Nazis and Hitler and the Holocaust. And eventually, sometime someday, somebody's going to get to that point there where they're actually saying, well, actually Hitler, sorry, we have people that try to do this now, but they're idiots and obviously wrong. But there's going to be somebody at some point in the future actually doing a sort of academic look at somebody like Hitler and saying, well, actually there was some good that came out of that. If you look at the development of technology and medicines as a result of the First and Second World Wars and blah, blah,
I
blah.
think the only thing that I'm actually comfortable saying good came out of that situation is that it brought the world together to say, no, we will not fucking stand for that.
Right.
Yeah. I get where you're coming from.
No, and
It
let me
just
be clear. I'm not saying there's any good to be found in Nazism, the Nazis and Hitler. I'm just saying that the way we look at history and the lenses we
changes.
choose to view it through, the pain, the tragedy that gets softened by the passage of time. When you don't have ancestors on your family tree within 3 or 4 rungs that were directly impacted by something that happened, you tend to look at things a little bit differently. Your perspective is very, very different. So I can look at studying ancient Assyria and Persia and things like that through a more dispassionate lens and find it interesting without saying, well, actually, these guys kind of knew what they were doing and had some good points. I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah. No, I get you. It's kind of how we have kids dressing up as pirates on Halloween now. And if you think about like who were the pirates and what did they do?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
All right. How about you? Do you have anything else you'd like to go back and take a look at?
I there's probably lots. I mean, I would love to. I've often thought, what would it be like if you were immortal and you had lived through it, right? Like how different would your perspective on the world be having lived through all of the things that you now see on the History Channel, and you would just be going, well, that didn't happen. That's wrong. That's not what really happened.
I mean, I watch the History Channel and say that now.
Well, that's true. I mean, the History Channel is mostly about aliens anyway now, right?
Right. It's not about history, that's for sure.
No, it's about digging up Treasure Island and mining for gold. And I'm not saying it was aliens, but it was aliens. So I have an interesting sort of semi-related tangent. Uh, if you could go back, and I don't know exactly how to frame this question because I mean the first answer is go back and shoot Hitler. But if you could go back and change, you can't directly change things. Like you can't change things that anyone knows about. You can't change. If you think about like how Doctor Who is like there's fixed moments in time. You can't
You're
change those.
what you're saying is you're breaking the very serious and set in stone rules for this thought exercise.
Yes, I'm
Okay.
I'm changing the thought exercise. Pray I
All right.
don't alter it further. Not so much. It's looking at, okay, well, like we've gone and looked at these things as if like, okay, we can't change things.
Mhm.
But if you could go back and change something that is relatively inconsequential to the arc of history, right? So you can't shoot Hitler. You can't go back and create Lugal. But you could change something, maybe just in your personal life. If you could go back, let's frame it like this. If you could go back and tell yourself something at the age of 16, and your 16-year-old self is going to believe you, what would you tell your 16-year-old self to do? What advice would you give your 16-year-old self?
I mean, the easy cop out answer is like, hey, invest in X, right?
Sure, but
Oh, hey,
I'm talking,
Apple, like,
yeah,
you frame this in the context of being self-serving. So the
fair enough.
easy answer is, hey, you know that company that's basically bankrupt right now? Why don't you
Invest.
throw a little money at them? Doesn't need
Yeah.
to be a lot. It really doesn't. Trust me, bro. You know?
Trust me, bro. Buy real estate.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
an
know it
interesting
looks
question. I
expensive.
mean, there's lots of things with regards to like, and I'm sure you've got similar things that you could say. The path that you took to get to where you are now in terms of your relationship and your love
I
life
don't
and
want.
those things, like,
I do not want to change that.
well, I mean, you got to where you are because of the steps that you took, but it almost like even if you could just go back and say to yourself, you know what, dude, I know it sucks right now. Like you feel like you've hit rock bottom, but it's
It's gonna
gonna
get
be
better.
okay.
Yeah,
Don't even have to tell yourself to do anything differently. Just be like, you know what? It's got to be this way, but it'll be worth it in the end. Chin up, you know?
yeah. Stiff upper lip. Honestly, I would. The one piece of advice that I would give to myself at 16 years old is nobody is watching you. Like,
That's an interesting one. You need to explain that a little bit more.
okay, so here's the thing: is that there's some things, and I'm not going to like tell the specific story, but I said something absolutely horrific to your wife at one point,
Hmm.
and I like looking back on who I was at that time. Like I was all about performing, right? And it was about everybody's watching me, so I have to be on. Like I have to be performing all the time.
Hmm.
Um, And the biggest change in my personal behavior is that I'm no longer like, I'm still concerned about what people think about me, but I'm not like, oh, I need everybody to like me. I need everybody to be impressed by me. Um, a line that I use to figure out if I actually want to work for somebody is I tell them I don't want to try and impress you. I want you to be impressed by me. Right. And it's a subtle difference.
Hmm.
But for me, like when I'm looking at like people to work with, if they understand the difference, that's somebody that I want to work with.
Hmm.
Right. And looking back on myself when I was younger, I did not understand the difference. It's like I have to do things to make people like me. I have to perform a certain way. I have to be loud and obnoxious, right? All of the toxic masculine bullshit that we are taught, or we were taught. I was anyway at a young
Hmm.
age, of like, this is who you have to be in order for people to respect you. I was just wrong.
Yeah.
And I learned that
That's an
way too late.
interesting one. I think I have a similar one.
Okay.
You have to love your family, but you don't have to like your family.
That's 100% true.
It's
100% true.
okay and okay, let me be clear. I'm talking about your birth family, your mother, your father, your aunts, your uncles, your sisters, your brothers. I'm not talking about who you choose to spend the rest of your life with and your own children here.
Yeah. Your
The
racist
amount,
uncle.
yeah, the amount of drama and just frustration and anguish and being put in hard positions and stuff. Like I don't. I mean, I'm not close to really anybody in my family anymore. I love them, and we get together at holidays and stuff like that. But they're not a daily part of my life anymore.
Hmm.
And we're all better for that. And I think people eventually get there. But if I could go back and tell myself at 20 or
Oh,
at 18, you know what? It's okay to admit that your family isn't great and to distance yourself from certain things.
yeah.
It doesn't mean you don't love them, but you could admit that you don't like them.
Yeah. It comes down to like being a little bit comfortable in your own skin, I think, and being able to say, like, not everybody needs to like me. It's okay if some people don't. It's okay. There's so much anxiety that comes from the and I see it in a lot of young people too, about like looking at Facebook and stuff, and you look at social media and everybody's perfect and everybody's polished and everybody's got filters on and everybody's on holiday in the Barbados, and it's like, that's bullshit. It's 100% bullshit. Nobody's actually that happy. nobody's
Hmm.
nobody's that content with their life. Like, contentment comes from acceptance. It doesn't come from you know skydiving in the Maldives. Anyway, so that took a little bit of a serious turn. We should make some jokes now.
Yeah, let's talk about the Greco-Persian Wars.
Crowbar, crowbar.
All right. Here's one of the interesting things about history is that there's some time periods that we know so much about, and then also so know absolutely nothing about. Um, we think of ancient Greece as something that we had a pretty decent idea of what it was, how it worked, what people did, how they fought. And the fact of the matter is we have no idea. Like the simple things. Like, the stuff that like we have that going back to the pirate thing, this sort of Hollywood kind of mainstream
Yes.
cartoonish idea of what they were that has no basis in reality.
What was the most popular breakfast food? Probably beer.
Yeah. So looking at the Greco-Persian Wars, so for anybody that's seen the movie 300 as a good example, or the sequels, I'm talking about this period of time that
There were
even
sequels?
there was, yeah.
Wow.
a series of conflicts between the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. Greece wasn't actually a thing. I guess that's one of the interesting things that, you got to say up front, is Greece wasn't a thing. There were all these Greek city-states that, we have different names for now, that, like Sparta, that wouldn't have actually, like, the city was named Sparta, but they would have gone by different names. They didn't like each other. They weren't a unified sort of like United States. They were spent most of their time warring with each other until, the big bad empire, who we tend to paint as the big bad empire, but like through the lens of history, if you're looking at it objectively, actually might have been the better option. Like, the world probably would be a better place right now had uh, the Achaemenid Persians had things panned out a little bit differently. Certainly things like science and the study of mathematics and things like would have been much more
Mhm.
at the forefront much earlier in what we would consider our direct history. Obviously, they would have all their own problems, but there's a few things. Like, most people have seen the shit about Thermopylae, right? The thing that is actually portrayed in the movie 300, the battle at the Hot Gates, which from the perspective of Persia was like a skirmish that happened on Tuesday, and while it was a minor inconvenience, they ultimately won handily and just kind of continued on their merry way. Uh, but I'm interested in why it was a minor inconvenience. It's clear, and we saw it later with sort of the further um,
The
extension of the
first
Greco-Persian Wars, and then leading up to Alexander the Great and his pushback into uh, the East. There was something that gave Greek combatants an advantage against what should have been a much superior force, both in terms of number, in terms of resource, in terms of logistics, in terms of funding. Like, it would be like if the United States now were to go to war with, oh, okay, actually, let me just come out and say it this way. It would be like if Russia went to war with Ukraine and Russia lost. On paper, it shouldn't happen. On paper, the Achaemenid Persians should have steamrolled through Greece. And you can argue that in the end they actually kind of won, but not through direct combat. But what they went through there, like, does it boil down to difference in just something as simple as armor, right? Weapons technology, the sword and shield or spear and shield versus the bow, or was there something else there that we're just not seeing? And that led me down a rabbit hole of, we don't actually know how Greek hoplites fought. We have these idea of these hedgehog phalanxes and stuff, but actual study into the weapons and technology that have survived through time make it very clear that, like, the positions and stuff that we think they put themselves into just weren't physically possible with the equipment.
Hmm.
So what was a hoplite? You also have to ask the question, when was a hoplite? Because it certainly changed over time as armor and weapons
Oh
adopted and
yeah.
stuff. But how did they actually fight? What advantages did it give them against the superior force, or what should have been a superior force in the Achaemenid Persians? And here's an interesting thought experiment. This is why this is on my mind a fair bit. There is a significant skirmish. It's not a battle. It was a scouting force that the Achaemenid Persians. This was before the time of Xerxes, so his father Darius the Great, uh, would have been sitting atop the Persian Empire at the time, and he sent a scouting force, a substantially sized scouting force, but a scouting force, uh, in the direction of Athens, and they came ashore outside a place called Marathon, and it's a very very famous battle that happened there.
Somebody ran a place and died, and now we do it for fun.
Why this is interesting, though, and I'm going to quote somebody here. Do I have the quote written down? I've got it paraphrased. So the Battle of Marathon, which happened in 490 BCE in northeast Attica, is more important event to British history than the Battle of Hastings, which happened in 1066 CE, like 50 miles south of London. We think of the Battle of Hastings as like this big defining thing for what would become Britain, right? The
Right.
United Kingdom and all of that. But realistically speaking, the events that happened at Marathon have a much more significant impact on what would become the UK and England and Britain than the Battle of Hastings. You know,
You're going to have to defend that argument.
well, imagine that Western civilization didn't exist. What we consider Western civilization, everything that sort of descended from the Greeks and Romans and Eastern Europeans, the Holy Roman Empire, basically everything in Europe.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah,
It,
because I mean, British society is basically Roman society. Basically,
you could argue that the Battle of Marathon is more important to the history of the United States than the Civil War.
you could, but only by a matter of it's the pebble that started the avalanche that came down the mountain.
That's why it's so interesting.
It's neat. Causality is neat, but I mean, I would argue with your use of the more important.
Okay,
Um,
had a more significant long-term impact on how history unfolded.
yeah, fair enough. Yes, for
You know,
sure.
I mean, with the Battle of Hastings, like England, Britain, in one form or another, already existed by the time of the Battle of the Hastings, right? Like it was more or
Yes.
less who's in control of it at this point. You know,
Yeah.
the relationship between the
The
Franks and shit at that
yeah
period of time. Whereas England, what we would think of as the people, the population, the governing presence, everything would not have
doesn't
existed.
exist. Yeah.
You know, somebody else would have been there, and
Well, yeah, the native population would have been there instead of the um, partially Roman uh, and various other peoples of the Roman Empire.
you know. So
Yeah.
I've got some other deep topics I'm going to skip. I obviously have to pay lip service to a couple of things. One, who wouldn't want to get a good look at dinosaurs? Like that's the obvious one.
Yes, that's been on my mind since we opened
Yeah.
this topic. Yes.
For a lot of reasons. Like, you know, again, some of it is purely scientific.
Feathers.
Like there's so much of the biodiversity of that time that just does not survive through the fossil record.
Can you imagine T-Rexes in lab coats doing experiments and you show up in a time machine and there, oh, thank God, there's an asteroid coming and we're not sure that we're going to survive.
I had a
uh,
book idea that started something like that a long time ago.
I have to, you know what, at some point I'm going to unpack the trunk and find all of the, aborted attempts that I've made at writing a novel and maybe pick one up again.
It's probably not appropriate for the episode, but I had some shower thoughts the other day, and I think I'm going to try and put an outline together at the very least. I have an
There you go.
interesting gimmick. It's not going to be wholly original because there's no original ideas anymore, but
We had a thing that we came up with at some point, and I can't remember if it was at like a first episode or a second episode. They really are different. We almost should put them in like two separate streams. Like here's the sober first episode, and here's the episode where we're mostly pissed.
yeah.
But we had something where we were talking about like doing some kind of creative thing where we passed it back and forth.
Mhm.
I think I said that out loud. Anyway, um,
You did.
anyway, we should do that. It would be good. It would entertain me anyway.
Yeah, it'd entertain me. Um, I mean, I'll approach it the same way I'll approach it talking about playing Baldur's Gate 1 again. I mean, we got to find the time and fit in and around all the interesting things that we want to do in the next few months.
Hey, listen, winter's coming sooner for me than for you. I'm going to be trapped in my house anyway. I may as well do something creative.
Was down to like 5C this morning. It was nice,
Yeah,
nice,
we're
brisk. I loved it.
we're gonna start getting freezing temperatures here in the next couple of weeks, I think.
All right. Well, you know what? I think unless you have anything else that you would want to explore with your time machine, I think I'm going to put a pin in that one.
Last week, I would like to look at last week. That's the one thing about time machines I think that people forget. And there was a really good short story that came out, and I wish I could credit the author, and I can't remember. But the sort of thrust of the story was is we have exactly what you're describing, where we can look at time through a window through like tachyon decay or something like that, right? But we can only go back so far, and we can't go any sooner or any farther into the future than 50 years ago. So we have a window sort of between 50 years and 150 years, and after that, it's too decayed and we can't reconstruct it. And some scientist was super extra pissed about it, so he got together with an engineer friend, and they made their own, and they basically released the plans. And then someone from the government took them aside and said, "Do you realize when the past starts? Like it literally starts right now." So if you have a time machine where you have a window into the past, you can literally look at 30 seconds ago, and you have up to the minute intelligence. So that's my message. Time machine bad, don't do it. And if you do make a time machine, please don't look at me, last night as I was going to bed. I took my pants off.
I was gonna say, oh, your wife wasn't home, right? So, like, who
That,
knows what kind of shit show that was?
I mean, I'm just fat and ugly and old. You don't want to see me naked.
Were you eating in bed?
I might have been.
Yeah.
I might have been. She left me cake, so you know what happens there.
Ooh. Hey,
Yeah.
let's get into a sort of a pod bag.
Okay.
You've got mail.
We've got a message from Carlos. Carlos says, "Hello. How is it going? Hope all is well. I have some cool information that might interest you. Your podcast, Nerding Under the Influence, has good performance in Apple Podcasts rankings last 30 days, position 101 in the category of games in Belgium. This data is provided by podstatus.com. Happy podcasting, Carlos from Podstatus."
How much do we have to pay to get all of the updated stats? Was the
Carlos,
pricing was the pricing
there
included
was
in the
no
spam?
pricing. Yeah, I
No?
wasn't gonna click on the link. But hey, Carlos, I question your intentions. I definitely question your judgment that you're reaching out to us thinking you're going to get anything. But
Uh,
listen, I just like hearing from you anyway. So, hey, Carlos, how's it going with you? I hope everything is well. I've got some cool information that you might be interested in. Nobody in Belgium's ever listened to us. But hey, if you're in Belgium and you have,
reach out. Send
cheers
us an
to you.
email.
Send us an email. podbag@nerdingundertheinfluence.com.
Yeah,
And
you can
Carlos, listen. If you ever want to talk about anything, buddy, I'm here for you. Reply to my email. I'll send you a link. Just click on it. What could possibly go wrong?
Oh man. You know what? I would be super excited if next week we had an email from that one listener in Belgium. And if you are listening in Belgium, I mean, like that's super awesome, cool. Belgium's a great country.
So Belgium's actually a country I know very little about.
I know
I should
very
go
little.
into a time machine and learn all about Belgium and their history.
I know not a lot about Belgium. It's one of those things where it's a question I think of no news is good news, right? Because if we hear about countries from that area of the world, it's typically because they've done something really really bad.
Mm-hmm.
I don't hear much about Belgium, so I assume that Belgians are just nice.
Hey, that's probably a good assumption to have. Doing the math, I'm not sure, if we got one listener in Belgium, like, does that put us in like position 101 in the category of games?
I would have to assume that means that Belgians don't play a lot of games.
I mean,
They're a very, very serious and industrious people, I guess.
like, what's the alternative? That Carlos is full of shit? I don't want to assume that.
Well, you know what? I just assume that Carlos is actually Chat GPT in a mustache and a fedora. So
Okay, wait. Why are you making the assumption that somebody named Carlos would have a mustache and a fedora?
the name wasn't even remotely involved. It was just a question of, like, when you have a cartoonish villain who's in a disguise, what do they do? They put on a fake mustache and a hat. I assume that he's also
So
wearing a
Carlos
trench
is the
coat.
villain now.
Well, yeah, in this story, in my head canon.
Carlos, I just want to make absolutely clear that the opinions being expressed here do not represent the opinions of Nerding Under the Influence as a whole.
50% of it, though. I would also like to point out that Carmen Sandiego was the inspiration for this particular mental image. So, I mean, how do you feel about Carmen Sandiego?
Noted mustache twirler, Carmen Sandiego.
It's a fake mustache. I very clearly stated that it was a fake mustache.
All right.
You know what? Every week we get together and we record about 2 hours worth of stuff, or 2.5 hours or something. And if you were interested in editing that down, I'll bet you could get 12 or 13 minutes of really good material.
8. Probably 8.
A solid 8.
Yeah. Not a grade 8, but like
yeah,
an okay
101 in Belgium in category games.
Right. Hey, the Belgians love it because it's short.
Oh yeah.
All right. Hey, I got some semi-relevant parting gifts for you all.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Anybody want a peanut?
We've been talking history this episode, so it only makes sense to have a history-themed parting gift. And while I watch and listen to some pretty expansive history stuff, my recommendation today is a YouTube channel that offers bite-size history. And they explore some really interesting sort of historical questions, stuff that you wouldn't even think to ask. Why was Texas carved up? Why no scramble for Australia? Why wasn't Italy occupied after World War II? It's 4 or 5 minute videos delivered in an entertaining and amusing way. Like, there's he's got a formula, and I laugh every time where he'll go and say something, and then he'll say something quickly rebutting it, but true fact, no. It'll be like, so and so did this, but actually no. And I don't know, there's just something about the way it's delivered. It is like very, very basic, sort of meant to be easily reused animation assets. So it's not stick figures, but it's like a step above stick figures. It's like block figures with funny hair and different colored skin. And as interesting as the content is, he does a read of all of his Patreon supporters afterwards, and the names of his patrons are just as amusing as the content. And it's one of the very few things, like, we all get to that point where, like, it's the end of a YouTube video, channel's doing a sponsor call out or something like that, and you're just like, yeah, I'm done. I don't need to listen to the rest of it, because I know there's nothing here but advertising, or nothing here but whatever it is, right? And Tanya and I have to listen to the end every time on this guy's videos just to hear all the names over and over again. We've got our own sort of canon of like what happens to these patrons when their names disappear, or sometimes some of them show up twice. And it's quite amusing. So anyway, History Matters on YouTube. Check them out. It's a blast, especially if you're interested in history. If you're not, it's still fun. They don't need our support in terms of viewership. I think he's doing okay. I think they got 1.6 million subscribers, so they're not nobody.
That's 12 or 13 more than we've got.
Yeah, checks out.
Math is hard. I would like to, this is the part at the end of the video where you can completely skip past this because we're done talking about anything of substance. But I would like to. I finished watching Ashoka last week, and I would like to talk about it next week.
Okay. Have you watched this week's episode?
What? There's more?
Yeah.
I thought it was over.
No, it was like eight episodes or 9 episodes in the season. Like episode 6 was today, last night at 9.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I haven't finished watching it. I'm glad I brought it up.
Yeah.
But we should totally talk about it because I have some things to say.
I bet you do.
I do.
All right, man.
And
it's been good chatting with you. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Same bat time, same bat channel next week. Star Wars next time.